Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for a discussion on building the Dream Incident Response Team. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Incident. This webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the lead dev Slack to answer some of your questions in the Effective Teams channel. We also should have some time to answer a few questions live, so please submit those through the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll get to those towards the end. So with that, let's meet our panelists today. Samantha, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I look frozen to myself. Can you hear me? Great. Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Sam. Work for Google. I'm a principal engineer in site reliability engineering, based in Switzerland.
Cheng, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Cheng. I'm an incident analyst at Indeed on the incident management team. So my full-time day job is looking at incidents and planning for them. I've been here since 2012. And let's see, I live in North Carolina.
Cool. Chris, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, folks, I'm Chris. I'm one of the co-founders at Incident.io. So we are, I think, sort of sponsoring this thing, but I promise you there will be no talk of our product in this at all. My background is in software engineering, so I spent a long time as a software engineer, then ran teams of software engineers, and then ran platform teams, and have caused and been involved in many incidents over that time. So yeah, great to be here.
Okay, thanks for that. And I'm your moderator today. My name is Matt Hawthorne. I'm currently an independent consultant focusing on AI ML platforms. Previously, I've worked at companies such as Twitter and Netflix. I've also written a book called Push to Prod or Die Trying. So with that, let's get into our questions, shall we? First question, what are the options for structuring an incident response team? Samantha, can you start us off?
Yeah, sure. This question was an interesting one because it provoked a lot of good terminology discussion amongst the panelists when we were discussing this before the actual panel. So I guess, just a little overview. I think there are some places in some organizations where it might make sense to have a full-time incident response team whose job is to kind of constantly be ready to respond to incidents, and that's their primary function. Maybe they work on tooling for how you do that in their downtime, but generally they're doing kind of on to the next incident as soon as one wraps up. There are other organizations, SRE is an example of this, at least at Google, and I think some other software teams may have similar setups where you have more of an ad hoc response team depending on whose knowledge and expertise are required for a given incident. And you kind of have everything in between. Sometimes incident response teams can turn into like project teams or things that kind of grow beyond the lifespan of the incident itself, but maybe started as a more ad hoc group.
Okay. Cheng, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think, okay, yes. I think different response options are appropriate for different phases of company life cycles, different growth sizes, and basically how much information can a responder possibly keep in their head, as well as what do the customers actually need? Like, is your service really need to be up 24/7, or is it fine for business hours, depending on what kind of service it is? You may have business customers, or you may have a consumer product. Different people have different expectations, or it may just be internal. So consider that it's not a one size fits all for any organization.
Okay. Chris?
Yeah, I think in my experience, when we discussed this previously, I think of like incident response teams as these sort of like ephemeral unit that gets assembled when something goes wrong. And I think even in a world where you have a dedicated central team that does this stuff, it's rare that they'll be solving everything completely by themselves. And so I think you get this weird dynamic where when incidents happen, certainly like larger scale, more sort of higher severity incidents, you necessarily end up like pulling together a bunch of folks who've probably never worked together or rarely worked together. And I think this is what, for me, as a bit of a nerd on this stuff, makes it so interesting, right? In that it's the reason why incident response is such a hot topic in organizations, because you have to sort of establish a whole bunch of norms and foundations and things so that these people who maybe don't spend a bunch of time working together and building like habits of how they work and how they communicate, you sort of have a structured base there so these people can all go, this is how we do it when this is the thing that goes wrong in these places. And so yeah, I think that's broadly how I think of it, is like these ephemeral units of people who have to follow a bit of a structured process, maybe more structured than they would be in their day-to-day work, just because the situation necessitates it.
I think that's an interesting paradox, because to build on that, like, you have to be more prepared for a less preparable event. By definition, your incidents are surprises. And so you cannot have planned for that, but you can prepare. You are going to have a surprise. I don't know what it's going to be. You're going to need to coordinate with a bunch of people you never talked to before, but you can't have talked to everyone in your organization in advance.
Yeah,
So
I
it's
think
a funny paradox.
I think that's huge, right? Which is like incidents are going to, if you sort of subscribe to the fact that that incidents are going to be novel things, right? They're hard to prepare for, and it's sort of, I think that's why organizations have such a strong emphasis on having those sort of, what can you can control? You can control that your process runs a certain way, or that you communicate in a certain way, or that you have certain roles that you like to have filled, and I think that stuff it takes the pressure off of that being novel ever. That should be routine and consistent so that your effort and attention can be on, the weird edge case you hit in Kafka, or whatever else it might be.
Okay, let's move on to the next question here. What are the best metrics to evaluate the effectiveness of your current incident response team? So regardless of how you've structured your team, how do we know if it's doing well or not? Cheng, can you start us off?
Sure. I guess building on what Chris just said, if you have plans on the mechanisms by which you prepared, you can measure that. Did we use the tools? Did people follow the processes that we planned out for them? The thing you can't really, I guess, fairly ask for the incident response team is to fix things in a prepared amount of time, because there's high variety in incidents. That's the whole point. They were unplanned, and they're novel, and they're not cookie cutter assembly line. Like, yes, we have a scientific method for make hypothesis, prove or disprove it, take action, make a new hypothesis, observe the data. But I think the two parts is looking at, did we respond the way we wanted to, even if it didn't have the outcomes we wanted? Did we do the behaviors we wanted that we predicted would give us good value? And bottom line, are the business metrics all right? There's not, I guess, very similar to reliability for any system. If you want uptime, there's diminishing returns as you try and approach 100%. It's much, much, much harder to add another 9 of reliability. Similarly, for incident response, how ready do you want to be? Do you want to answer the phone and have things solved in minutes, seconds, not be visible at all to other than computers? Well, you're going to have different kinds of investment. So I think the thing you should be measuring is the business metrics for your business, and use that to tell you whether you should invest more or less in being prepared. So that's what I have to say about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh.
Go ahead. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Samantha.
I'll just add, I think there's another, like one more layer, a little more abstract. Like, I think you can also get a lot of value over looking at changes in things like outage duration or time to mitigation over time. You're not going to always have, like, each incident will be novel and there are different classes of them. But if you look at like year on year, are we getting slower or faster at mitigating incidents? And then maybe looking at, why that might be, maybe you can find some larger trend or shape of a problem that you might be able to do something about. So I recommend generally looking at some regular kind of longer term cadence, quarterly, twice, 3 times a year, and see, are your incident metrics trending in a good direction or a bad direction, or is anything different at all? And maybe which ones do you want to see if you can fix or do something to bring down the time?
Chris, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I agree with both Sam and Cheng on this. And I think actually, so like looking at longer term trends often gets a bit of a bad rap in like incident circles, where people are like, you can't possibly measure how long things are taking because everything's novel, and it's a bit like, you can't do that. And I think I think as a starting point for an investigation, what Sam mentioned is like actually super pragmatic and super like sensible as a place. And I know that like mean time to recovery, you mentioned the word, and a bunch of people will be hounding you these days, and justifiably so, right? Because they, if you look at it and you go, well, you're sort of averaging a bunch of data that shouldn't really be averaged, and there's lots of scientific stuff behind it. Yes. But if you sort of go, if you have enough samples and the numbers going up, and you're going to put in the work after the numbers gone up to understand why and the nuance behind all of that, I think it is a good or it can be a useful, very high level metric. I think also there are to like Cheng's point, like being able to measure, like if you have a response that you're like, this is how I think we should do things. I think being able to and you sort of everyone believes and buys in that that is good. Being able to measure how you are doing against that is actually quite a useful way to understand how you're doing. So a good example would be like, we have our organization, we say, listen, like we would love to have in major incidents, and we'll get onto severities later, but like in major incidents, we want to have a cadence of like, 15-minute updates sent to the incident, so people are sort of kept plugged in on that stuff. It's really easy to measure that. It's really easy to go like, did we do well? And I care about that not because that's the process, but because I believe the process leads to good outcomes, which is like if we share updates, it forces people to think and sort of pull out of the rabbit hole of whatever incident they're in and be like, hey, like we're thinking about it, this is what's going on, et cetera, et cetera. But it also gives a really nice point for the rest of the organization to sort of get a checkpoint and potentially self-select into helping with an incident, for example. So it's like I send an update that says I'm seeing some issue somewhere. Someone in the other side of the organization might see that and go, oh my gosh, I have context on that. I can jump in and help. And so that's very easy to measure. There's lots of things I think in that vein that you can measure, which is like how long is it taking you to sort of mobilize an incident response? If you care about having people, I don't mean like mean time to acknowledge. I think that's not a very high fidelity metric. It's like how fast can someone push a button when the thing with the button on it's making a noise? It's like usually pretty quick. But it's like how long does it take us from when the first alert fires to the sort of right person or the most useful person to help us respond to that incident at the start being there and ready to respond? That's a useful thing because it uncovers a bunch of organizational complexity, which is like, does our alerting point at the right team? How quickly, if it's not the right team, can we find the right team? And so those things are like very easy to put quantifiable measures on. But yeah, I promised I wouldn't say anything about product, but we do some of this stuff, and I think it's like it's genuinely quite helpful to be able to look at it quite objectively.
Yeah,
Okay.
I will pile on to Chris very briefly and say, yes, absolutely. You want to measure things that are in your control, and how you respond, independent of the incident, is something within your control. And the other part was, yes, averaging bad, but diving into specific cases. And I would push back on just looking at the ones that ran extra long. Look at the ones that ran extra short, because you want more of those. Whatever it was they did there, see if you can get more of that.
Okay. So let's move on to our next question. Was there a specific situation that made you realize the importance of having a well-structured incident response team? Chris, can you start us off?
Yes. I think I'd be lying if I said there was like a very, very specific event where the light bulb went off. These things are typically like, amalgamation of experiences along the way. But like looking at this question and sort of thinking back, I once had like a really bad incident, and it was the employer I was at before this one, a bank called Monzo here in London. I should say actually this incident was publicly written up, so I'm not divulging any secrets that are going to get me in trouble. But we had a very, very significant incident that was the result of my team doing a database upgrade, which was a totally routine thing for us to do, and we messed something up. The incident itself ended up involving about 40 people. That was like engineering executives, PR people, risk and compliance people, like pretty broad across the organization. We were totally offline for 2-3 hours where customers couldn't get their money and things like that. Basically, it was a bad situation. And I think it was this incident where I was sat in like, we had a room commandeered in the headquarters in London. And so we had all these different engineering teams who were all independently, like this very big incident that crossed the whole organization. They were independently all kind of doing the right things in their respective domains. So they were like masters of their own domain, obviously, but they were also sharing regular communication updates. They were also like had clear sort of like leads of whatever it was that they were doing. So there was a point person in there. They were all sort of focused on like what was the impact, how quickly could we like mitigate that thing. And I think that for me was the moment where like it's sort of to the point I made earlier, the importance of having this process. And in that incident, that was a major incident, right? And it involved all these little teams doing the process that they had rehearsed on many, many smaller incidents over the time, but also then sort of bringing those teams together themselves and them all kind of working cohesively as this unit as well. And I think it was just like, for me, like when you talk about like well-structured incident response team, that's like the extreme end of what a bad incident gets to. And I think the sort of the culture of establishing, running many smaller incidents all the time, thinking about and encouraging reporting of things and having people sort of run things well led to this essentially good outcome in the big things. So yeah, for me that was a moment where I was like, it makes sense to put the investment into this stuff because it pays off when you know, in sort of like organization-wide preparedness, I guess.
Okay. And Samantha, can you speak to this next? And if you don't have a specific situation, we could expand it to like differences you've noticed in places that had basically handled incidents well versus places that didn't handle them as well.
Yeah, I guess I've chatted about this particular incident in a couple other lead dev events. So if you've seen me talk before, I've probably talked about this, but bear with me. I worked with the Google Meet team during the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And that was kind of, I'll describe it as like the ultimate incident. And it actually, it was like many weeks long, and it was not typical in by many measures, but we did run it in a structure that was very similar to how we would run a like normal production outage type incident, even though we weren't actually experiencing a production outage yet. It was more of a anticipatory structure. And like I spent a lot of time. I was one of the incident commanders for that incident for a few weeks, and the thing that I kind of realized was how important. Like I saw my role as incident commander as effectively, it was my job to make the information flow as efficient between all the different people working on such a large topic with so many different groups and stakeholders who wanted information for different reasons and who needed to like push out updates or information for a variety of reasons. And this kind of refining that we had so long, the incident went on, that like we were able to tweak it a lot and kind of get to a state that was much more effective by the end of it, even though there were other problems. We were all very tired and wanted to go back to normal working hours. But having the structure really made a huge difference. We'd have all kinds of things at the beginning where it was like, well, in Europe time, the team made some progress on a problem, but they didn't write a very useful like handover to the team in California. And so then we'd waste 24 hours because like, oh, actually we already found the answer to that thing, but like no one kind of properly wrote it down in a way that other people would know and could make progress. And so we kind of built up a lot of I'd say the most complete version of incident management and kind of communication tools and all the things you might want to do during a shorter incident. It's just often we would do like some of them during a shorter incident, but we kind of had a huge toolbox we built up by the end of this. So that made it really clear, like we could even kind of experiment with like, does this help the incident management structure for this one same incident because it was running for so long? So that was really formative for me.
Shane, do you have anything to add?
I don't have a good one. There's a lot of small bad ones, but I'm not going to bore you with it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the COVID story is so interesting because it's like if you were good at responding to incidents before that happened, that probably made you a lot better at responding to that real world event. Okay, so let's move on to the next question here. How knowledgeable does your incident response team have to be about system architecture or other technical details? And what are the best ways to make this information available for an incident response team to utilize? Cheng, can you start us off?
Sure. Something we talked about earlier was there may be no singular incident response team. It may just be an ad hoc group of people to get together. So you may not know who you're preparing for. And so I think the important parts, I don't think beyond a system that could live in one person's brain. It's not really reasonable for them to know everything about how to go into the code and fix it all. But the important parts, I think, would be to tell them who or how to contact or escalate. If this thing is broken and you can identify it's this thing, who should I get help from? The expertise is not going to be very likely in random person who happens to answer the initial notification. So other things that are helpful to tell them are what are the implications of short, long, and corruption outages on this system. People often forget about when things aren't working, it's not that they're off. They may be working wrong, and that may persist some data or have side effects that corrupt other systems downstream. So you need to be at least tell them this could have some impact if it is working and incorrectly. That's actually more important than if it's not working at all. That's usually pretty obvious. Another thing I'd like to arm responders with is what is generally safe for you to do with this system. Fail it over, fail it out, put up a maintenance sign. Just write those down and put it in a place that the responders are likely to be able to find. And ideally, if you have automated alerts triggering your responders, put links to that, where to find that information in the alert itself. If your alert can tell you, I'm going off and there's a whole book about how to respond to this, the various numbers in this, and here it is, here's the link. Then that's another place they don't have to remember or think about when they get woken up in the middle of the night. Those are my recommendations.
Okay. Samantha, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I've been on a variety of, I'll call it like service-specific on-call rotations, as well as like we call them incident response, IRT groups that are more like, let's say, one level, or like a scope of those is like multiple different services that might have their own more immediate responders, kind of a second tier escalation rotation. And so I think the main thing, I no longer, maybe I used to believe it, I no longer at least think that you have to absolutely have a lot of deep technical knowledge of the specific system that might be broken. I think it is useful. It often helps you find maybe paths out of your problem or your incident faster. But the real value, I think, is knowing who to contact, as Cheng was saying, like having a sense of like, if it's this component, I should bring in this person, or I know how to contact the team who owns this thing. And having a really strong feeling for how to structure these incidents. And some of this can be then like kind of engineering culture for everyone at the whole company. And if you have everyone who kind of has the same norms around incident response, you can end up having, I think, people who can run incidents effectively that basically are comfortable saying, well, I don't know deeply about the system and I'm not going to get trapped in figuring it out right now, because my job as like an incident commander is to go find someone who can answer this one question, and I'm going to focus on kind of running the overall incident myself. So I think, but knowing the architecture can help speed things up, but I don't think it's a requirement.
Okay. Chris?
Yeah, I guess like how knowledgeable do people need to be? It's like as knowledgeable as like reasonably practical. Given a choice, I'd be like, make everyone super knowledgeable. And there's things I guess you can do to catalyze or help organizations to become more knowledgeable over time, which is like, on one end of the spectrum, it might be like, hey, just write more postmortems and share them and things like that, which is helpful. I think it has, I've seen it sort of have limited utility in sort of practical applications because everyone's busy and everyone, like, not many people have the time to sit down and read like a lengthy document about, an incident. I think given the choice, many engineers would. They'd happily sit down with a coffee and just nerd out on, the intricacies of Cassandra and whatever else it might be. I think there's more practical things you can do, which is like just run incidents transparently in the open, and people will sort of like self-select and be like, I'm curious about that. And I'll drop into a channel. I'll just like pick a few tidbits out of there. And so that is another good way I've seen that like helps to spread that knowledge. And then I think when you sort of tap out of the like, what can humans reasonably fit in their brain or like retain or acquire knowledge wise, I think like technical systems can help here, which is like, there's a swathe of like service catalog products out there, which are like, hey, how do I how do I understand the like complexity of my organization? Often just knowing the boxes and the arrows is really, really helpful in incidents to be like, well, this system's down, probably means this might be impacted, and that's owned by this team, and I can go and contact those folks. And I think on that, if you're going down that track and that is the sort of your fallback that you're trying to implement, I think the way to make that as successful as possible is just like put the like requisite effort into making it a living thing, not the spreadsheet that was the source of truth at the point of time when the person wrote it, because that can be an absolute pain in the ass, honestly, when you're dealing with an incident and you're like, great, I found the person, and you're like, they don't work here anymore and they left 9 months ago. Deeply frustrating. So yeah, I don't know, my 2 cents.
Yeah, they don't work here anymore because their system kept breaking.
Yeah, that's the culture here. 3 strikes and you're out.
Yeah, pretty much. All right, let's move on to the next question. How do you handle the human aspects of incident response, like stress, blame culture, and team morale, especially during major incidents? I guess burnout could be another thing too. Samantha, can you start us off?
Yeah, I think there's a number of places in the incident life cycle that this comes into play. I think I like to think of incident responders as kind of, this may be very nerdy, they're human extensions of the software systems that they're interacting with. And you kind of, if you look at it from the perspective of we don't expect 100% from any particular software system, like we also can't expect that every responder is going to always make the right call and that they're always going to do the right thing. And we need to be able to support them. Like I focus on kind of how can we make the easiest thing someone does the right thing, right? Like have well-lit paths and default tools and processes and documentation as up to date as it can reasonably be expected to be, which is often not up to date, but you get the idea. Like if someone makes a mistake, like focus on where they thought, like assume they were doing something they thought was reasonable or under stress, and like it's not as important that they made the mistake as like how can we make it harder for someone to make the mistake again, and thinking of it kind of from a systems perspective. So I think there's a lot of kind of culture that comes a lot from leadership, right? People in this panel I'm sure are familiar, and people participating, like this is lead dev, there's a lot of kind of how do you set the tone and expectations of your organization for what's expected, because when you ask someone to put themselves kind of into this high stress situation of like something's broken and it needs to be fixed right now, maybe an executive is yelling at the team, like that stress is not a situation that is easy for everyone to handle. And so I think it's also important to help support people who are put in that position, who volunteer to be in that position, so that they continue to want to be in that position. So, I also think that there's a kind of a reward component, like when someone has done worked on an incident or done a really great job doing an incident response or worked on a particularly hard incident, having structures for where that's rewarded within the engineering culture is super important. Like it's not just grunge work, like having a way for, whatever kind of modes you do, like if there's a public like kudos or awards or spot bonuses or whatever, like making sure that people feel like this work is actually rewarded, especially if it's not their core responsibility, is super important. Make it feel valued. In addition to that, like visibility and knowledge sharing can also go kind of up your org chart, right? Like for really important incidents, having involvement from executives that also can say that they appreciate that this was high stress and that a lot of work went into resolving the incident. That kind of thing can pay off as well. And I guess on the burnout topic, like I'll just also mention that the longer an incident goes on, and depending on how your organization is laid out, whether or not you have kind of one time zone worth of people or multiple time zones, having some strategy for how you can hand off work between your incident responders to someone else is super important. It'll look a little different in different situations, but one thing we tried when we had this COVID scaling incident was to have a kind of warmed up standby, because we knew this was going to likely go on for weeks at a time. It made sense to have kind of a backup or a secondary person for each role in our incident response team. And they just started kind of following along, going to meetings, reading the same documents and catching up on what was going on, so that if the primary person needed a few days off or they got sick with COVID or whatever, like we would have someone who already knew what was going on in that space. That worked out pretty well for us. But obviously that's expensive, and you'd only do that when you kind of expect to need to keep going for a long time.
Okay. Chris, do you have anything to add?
Yes. I think firstly, I massively agree with like all of the things that Sam just said. So massive +1 on that stuff. I think some stuff, I think you were mentioning like rewarding people for like, making sure that that work isn't sort of hidden work that's like, not seen and not recognized. And I think recognition of like opsy incidenty kind of work is something that I've seen tied into like career, like what are they called, frameworks for like, level this looks like, you've spent time doing this and that, and actually responding to incidents. And it's not that everyone has to do it, but they are markers of seniority and expertise inside of an organization, which are worth rewarding. Like some of the best engineers I've worked with have been the ones who are the first in an incident and helping people along the way, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think like touched a little bit on like the human side of like burnout and things like that. And I think annoyingly, like the answer to a lot of these things is like good culture. And so like a great example of this would be like we have a process internally at our organization where like if you've been paged overnight, someone from the team will just proactively put cover in on the pager for the next day to give you a day off. And that is not process at all. It's something that was sort of born out of the culture. But I have worked in places where it wasn't like the original culture, and the way that it was embedded as culture was to first make it process, which was like, hey, if you're an engineering manager, your job is to keep an eye on the pager in the morning, and if someone's been paged overnight, your job is to like set up and find someone else in the team who can go and take that cover for them to give them some time off to come back. I think some of that stuff is like effective, practical tips you can do to kind of reduce the toil on people.
Chang, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, +1, big +1 to everything Sam and Chris just said. I would say write down the culture you want. It doesn't have to be a formal process, but if you write it down, for example, if you want your reviews to be sanctionless, put that in the template for your review documents, and then reinforce it socially while you're talking about it. If you see people trying to do bad things to people, point them to the thing you just wrote down and say, this is not what we want to be doing. And then for burnout, normalize teamwork. I would say de-emphasize heroism. Heroes are great if you are the only person in the company, and they're terrible if you want to sleep.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. What are techniques for effectively mitigating incidents? Chris, can you start us off?
Yes. I sort of yes, I think if I had the answer to this, I'd probably be dialing in from like my yacht in the Mediterranean or something. But I'm going to answer this in the sort of, how do you keep folks focused on mitigating and not sort of like fully going deep on like resolving incidents? I'll answer in that vein. If there's another way to answer or ask it, let me know. But I think there is always a tendency in incidents for like what you want, right, is mitigation to be the focus. So there's some impact that's happening, whether it's customer impact or risk exposure or financial impact, whatever it might be. And what you really, really want to do in an incident is kind of be laser focused on like what are the fewest steps that we can take to stop that. That can, I think, where that gets quite uncomfortable, especially working, and I say this as an engineer myself, working with engineers, is that can often mean quite inelegant solutions, which are sometimes uncomfortable. Like no one wants to sort of string and sellotape something back together when you could put a much better fix in place that takes a bit longer. And so I think that is a sort of, again, a sort of tone you have to set across your teams, which is like your goal is not to fix it properly. Like there will be a time and we will review it. As long as your sort of like temporary measures hold, the goal is to make them hold until the next morning when everyone can come in and we can look at this with sort of fresh perspective and fresh eyes. So that I think is my sort of, I guess, really unhelpful but sort of practical advice on how I've seen sort of keeping teams focused on mitigation. And again, it comes from like repeat kind of reinforcement of that message being the thing, and that's something you can sort of make part of your process documentation. It can make it part of like incident managers who drop in and help sort of focus people on those things. And I think when you do the reps, it becomes the norm, right? That an organization establishes, which is I'm just focused on mitigation during an incident mode. There'll be time for longer term stuff.
Samantha, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's all 100% true. I also think that one way to answer this question is also looking at it from the perspective of an incident manager, especially when there's more than one person working on the incident at once, is like enacting kind of a delegation of responsibilities to different people, right? Like having one person who knows it's their job to go work on root cause, which is separate from someone who's looking at the fastest way we can mitigate something, who might be separate from someone who's doing all the comms or talking to executives or customers or gathering more bug reports or whatever. So like that often in my experience is if you have more people around in the middle of the night, maybe this is not the way you'd go, but if it's during business hours, then, pull more people in, give them really clear directives and responsibilities and have them keep reporting back to you so you can manage the information flow.
Chang, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, +1, divide and conquer. If you can even think of another thread to spin up, call someone so they can go work on that. And I would add to people's idea of mitigation, expand that to anything that can make the customer experience better. Even just the simple step of acknowledging, we know something is wrong with this section. You may have errors or we aren't going to let you in. Doesn't even hold it overnight necessarily, but it's a lot better than, this is weird. Let me just hit refresh 5 billion times and see if that makes it better. Is it me? Is it you? So anything that could make the customer experience better, even if it doesn't even temporarily make things better, maybe you can make it better for some people, but not other people. Anything, pull some lever, please, before looking for a final perfect solution. Very tiny story. One time we were working with a vendor and their stuff was broken and our site was not working. And their engineers were like, oh, we need to keep this instance open so we can capture the debug log so we can go fix it properly next time. And we're like, no, at some point we just overrode them and say, no, we're just restarting this thing. We're going to take a loss, but we need the system on. We don't need you to find the answer today.
Okay. I'm going to skip to this incident severity question because it aligns very closely with an audience question that we got. So here's the question: how to measure incident severity in a way that's aligned with the nuances of product error handling. For example, quantifying severity by the volume of affected customers can be tricky when systems are using things like fallbacks or hiding errors or things like that. And the audience question basically said was very similar. So like, how do you derive business impact from like an incident? And so, Chang, can you start us off on this one?
Yeah, I have a very hot take on this, which is that you shouldn't spend a bunch of time figuring out the severity during the incident. If the idea of the severity is to elicit a response, then just tell people you need that response. It has low utility afterwards as well. So it's hard to compute in the moment with the information you have. And it's very distracting from actually doing the mitigation we were talking about. And I don't think it provides value later. Hopefully you're already tracking the business functionality, so you'll know whether it's impactful or not. And I got I guess, a challenging question about why would you spend more action based on afterwards, based on how damaging it was versus near misses or small impact. If you were able to successfully mitigate something and make it tiny, so it wasn't a big deal, it seems like there's a lot to learn there. But as far as assembly, at least in our organization, we have like thousands and thousands of engineers. We generally organically get the right set of people in the room, approximately the right time, without really leaning on official severity. Executives ask for severity in hindsight, and I don't know what they want to do with it because they already know what the impact was on their business. And
Okay.
but something my previous manager told me, which blew my mind, was incidents are a figment of their construct, their mental construct. There's no beginning and end. Maybe it's a bunch of little incidents, and you wrap them all together because they're the same. I don't know. You made that up in your mind. Is this one incident? Is this lots of little incidents?
I see. Chris, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think on that point, I think the world can get very arbitrary if you start going down the like, what is it? What even is an incident, man? It's kind of like, I think most of the time people can intuit when something bad is happening and know how to sort of deal with that stuff. Um, and I think like on severity specifically, like I find them very useful personally, right? And so uh I might know what the business impact is, but like if I know what the business impact is afterwards and it's sort of quantified, maybe that's fine. But often the proxy I use for my business impact is severity. So personally, if I'm looking back over a week and I'm like, what happened this week? I find severity just a useful lens to apply to the incidents to be like, which ones do I want to care about and which ones should I look at? So, from a personal point of view, that's a thing. I think the case against, I often hear against severities is like one of two things, which is like, one, you can't possibly fit this, thing in a box. Like, how can you define what the severity is for this thing? It's like everything's, people, and there's like, I'm like, okay, cool, but like, I will happily lose a bit of fidelity for a bit of shared understanding there. Is like number one. And then number two, the thing people will say is it's like, why do you want to spend loads of time in an incident thinking about the severity? Personally, I haven't seen that happen a lot where people waste time arguing over severity. And when they do, I think it actually nets out quite positively, which is like the discussion over what the severity should be is the sort of forcing function for people to think about the impact. And so by saying you want a severity set on an incident, you force people to go, hang on, I think it's this, you think it's that. That's interesting. Like and we true it up and we get to some form of like shared understanding. We go, great, we think it's a major one. And then all the things that happen to the business, that the business cares about. I think cases for it, obviously, like that shared understanding is a big one. Engineers don't exist in a vacuum, and so for the organization to have something in the heat of an incident to hang off of as a trigger for things happening is useful. Like we used to have a thing at Monzo, which is like every major incident you have to invite it. We would automatically invite someone from the press team in because that could be a thing, and it was like sometimes it worked, sometimes it wasn't great. And then the final thing is like some organizations literally don't have a choice about severity. So I worked in a bank and we were regulated, and so we literally had major reporting requirements, and so we had imposed upon us criteria. And so I think this kind of like basically you're going to have to do it anyway. You might as well do it in a way in which it sort of works for your organization. I think to the specifics of the question that I saw, there was like I think it is really challenging when you have many teams and a really big organization for each of those teams to have an appreciation of the incident at their level, what it has at the sort of macro level for the organization. I mean, I've had some of this. I've worked in a few thousand person organizations where this has been there. I think the few things I've sort of focused on is like number one, make your severity like definitions as like easy to check as possible. So if you're like we categorize it as some quantifiable impact on customers, have somewhere some metric, some dashboard that is like number of edge requests failing or 5xx's hitting your most external load balance. There's usually something in that, and have people be able to use that as a sort of reference. And then like I think finally, and you can do that with a bunch of things and get to a bunch of simple criteria people can use and places people can go to check to be able to make slightly objective assessments on the severity. And then fundamentally like just lean on like up leveling your severity. So if you're on the fence, go for the bigger one and make sure all the things happen there. And typically that will involve someone with greater context at the sort of broader abstraction level being brought into that incident to help you out. And I think that's a totally fine outcome for most organizations. Sorry, went on a bit of a tangent there.
No, it's fine. Samantha, do you have anything to add?
I was going to touch on the regulatory reporting requirements one, which is also, I think, worth underscoring. Some of us don't have a choice, and so that's a useful way to get it. I think it is, though, like, I agree with, I think, both of you on the, like, you don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of, like, what even is a construct man. But, like, I think the act of describing the norms for your organization, especially if you're a larger organization, is really useful, because what ends up happening, at least in my world, is severity is really useful, particularly when you have an incident that was where follow-up is expected across multiple different groups. If you want to be able to like ask a dependent service, maybe your database team, like to follow up on some particular issue, And they said, oh, for us, this was a minor incident. And then for maybe your product that's built on top of it, you're like, well, but we called this a major incident. So, getting to some sort of like this is a very clear way of at least capturing the problem, which will be that like any AIs maybe for the dependency team, like they might not think are as important. And so this severity sometimes helps find a path forward where you can align on expectations.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think severity in my experience, it's like a proxy for priority, and my priority might not be your priority, and it's a way to get us there. Okay, so with that, we are at time. So thanks to all of the panelists today for sharing your insights and experiences. We'll all now be heading over to the Lead Dev Slack in the Effective Teams channel. So please head over there to continue the discussion. And thanks for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.